Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, the art world's AI moment of reckoning, the unstoppable rise of comic art, and Degas' painting of a black acrobat. The publication in April of Stanford University's Artificial Intelligence Index annual report provided the art world with much food for thought. We look at the implications for artists and institutions with Louis Jebb, the managing editor of the art newspaper and our technology specialist. As the Centre Pompidou in Paris is taken over on all its floors by what it calls the ninth art, graphic novels and comics, I talked to Joel Meadows, the editor of Tripwire magazine and a comics aficionado, about the rise of this subculture in museums and the market. And this episode's work of the week is Edgar Degas Miss at the Cirque Fernando from 1879, which depicts a black circus performer, Albertine Olga Brown, who was briefly known as Miss Lala. She and the painting are the subject of a new exhibition at the National Gallery in London, opening next week. I talked to Anne Robbins, the curator of paintings at the Musée in Paris, and external curator of the exhibition, and Sterre Overmars, the curatorial fellow for post-1800 paintings at the National, about the work. Before all that, our latest subscription offer, a free 6-week trial of a digital subscription to the Art Newspaper. Visit theartnewspaper.com to find out more. And do also subscribe to this podcast and our sister podcast, A Brush With, wherever you're listening. The new series of A Brush With began this week with a conversation with the Belgian painter, Michael Borremans. Please also give us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Now, we've looked at artificial intelligence on this podcast in the past, but the subject has gained a new urgency as developments have continued to proceed at an astonishing rate, forcing some artists and most institutions to consider how best to reckon with the latest implications of this phenomenon. AI is the subject of the front page story in the June edition of the Art Newspaper, and I spoke to our managing editor and tech expert, Louis Jebb, to find out why. Louis, the Art Newspaper have done a big front page splash on AI this month. Why now? What's the reason?
The reason is that Stanford University in California has published its 7th annual Artificial Intelligence Index report. This is the most comprehensive report of its kind, and importantly, it covers a 12-month period where the AI industry has become a fact of all our lives.
Right. Do you think it's a fact in all our lives in a way that's different to before? Because whether acknowledged or unacknowledged, AI has been rumbling along in the background of our lives for quite some time. What's different about it now? Why are we more conscious of it now, if you like?
It's more present because we're aware of its power and because it's part of daily discourse. Why? Because things both verbally and textually are put in front of us daily, and because we now have consumer products which are part of our daily lives. So whether it's text generating art or image generated art, these are things that are with us daily. You know, the background power of AI has been around, as you say, for more than a decade. It's been there lurking in the background. But the launch of ChatGPT in November 2022 and its rivals, which have caused Google, Meta, Microsoft to come into the foreground on these things. So the tech giants have joined in. This makes it much more real to people. And it becomes apparent that it's going to affect everybody's daily life, their daily work. Might their work and how they do it be affected by AI? And for the art world, there were 2 particular areas that the Stanford report highlighted. For artists, it was a question of how much big tech dominates things financially. For museums, it's a question of what is it to work with big tech to surface your wonderful data sources for the benefit of your visitors, for art lovers. And what does that really mean? Where fundamentally you're dealing with a big private corporation, rather than with a public interest.
The interesting thing, I guess, about this is there's a brilliant stat in the piece, which is that it says that 52% of people are more concerned than excited by AI, which is up from 37% 2 years before. So alongside this greater consciousness of AI has come a greater anxiety about AI. And I guess that anxiety comes into our sector too. The art world is suddenly much more conscious about AI, its properties, and as you say, the different implications for different sectors within the art world.
Yes, there's this existential worry about the power of these systems. When you have founders like Sam Altman of OpenAI talking openly about, the future of his work will be making sure that what he's making is safe for the world. I mean, he said that the other day. And where we have just had the 2nd global summit on AI in Seoul, Korea. And people said, this is just a talking shop. It's a follow-up to the Bletchley Summit in the UK, led by Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. However, the very fact that you have big corporations and governments getting together to say they want to do something is the first step and an important one. And a reflection that this matters to voters, frankly.
Yeah, it matters to us all.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the different sectors that we were talking about. First of all, let's deal with artists. In a way, I feel like this is the least existential, if you like, because artists don't need to make work using digital means. They can make work with whatever means they like. They still paint, they still draw, they still make sculptures, they still do things that do not rely in any way on the digital world. And yet, there is a digital frontier in art. And even that has big questions to answer over the coming months, right?
It's extremely interesting. And luckily, we already have one or two good models for this. So Refik Anadol, who's one of the most globally present digital artists, somebody who's been at the cutting edge of all kinds of moments of art and technology. He has created his own large language model. That is a program where huge amounts of data are assembled. In this case, images from natural history archives, ethically sourced from the leading academic institutions in the world who collaborated with him. And he's created this data set and started to run instances with prompts to create artworks. Now, the key thing there is that he has been very open about how this has worked. So he has collaborated with Google, one of the big tech giants, who have given him the compute power to do this, and with NVIDIA, the soar-away chip-making company, who have given him that side of the equation.
So it's a software-hardware thing, basically.
Yeah, a software-hardware double thing. And it's very interesting because he, like some of the other experts we spoke to, is realistic that if you want to play at this level, you need to partner. The question is, what does this actually mean, either for your art or for your institution?
Right, exactly. And interestingly, you've spoken to the team at the Serpentine, who I would say are probably, alongside the new museum and Rhizome in New York, I would say the Serpentine are probably the most advanced, the most sort of public in terms of institutions on either side of the Atlantic who are really grappling with the big questions about tech and so on. And it's interesting that they're talking about actually what are the ethics of engaging on any level with big tech? Because, of course, big tech has motivations and so on that might actually not be that compatible with the creation of art.
Yeah, this is true. And also they make a very good point, which is that the Stanford report is about how the big corporations control or own a lot of the what they call frontier advances in AI. In other words, the big tech breakthroughs that excite the tech world. And they make the point that museums, artists don't necessarily need the latest tech breakthroughs. What they need is to be able to play an experiment in what you call the open AI, or essentially open source approach, where artists and museums have full access not only to the functionality but to the data behind it. You know, a lot of the headlines around the Stanford report have resolved around the fact that financially, you know, it is Silicon Valley that is monetizing this industry. The big tech corporations have been the ones to make the big, exciting, what I call the space race breakthroughs in AI in the last few years. But they also highlight two other things. And one is that there's never been a better year for collaboration between big tech and academia in terms of volumes of breakthrough. And this, as it were, bodes well for art institutions in terms of there is a model for collaboration. But also to point out that, you know, the game is not up. The jury is not out, as the managing editor of the report said, because there is a limit to this game when you're playing with very, very large multi-billion item data sets, because the data runs out. And what the report does say that if you try and synthetically create your own data, the results degrade. You don't get such good results. Therefore, the possibilities for academics, for artists, for people who happily work, you know, between the two, is that you can make an invention that makes the use of data far more efficient, and the whole game could change. So the really important thing about the report is it's not all doom and gloom.
Right, yeah.
In terms of, you know, everything belongs to four big companies in Silicon Valley. It's not just saying that. And the important thing is that this industry moves fast. You know, the reality is, though, that the ownership is at the moment in Silicon Valley.
Right. Now, if the ownership's in Silicon Valley, you've got curators, institutional figures and so on questioning whether big tech's contribution to this is going to present a kind of ethical framework in which artists can work. then how can artists steal a march, if you like, on the extraordinary wealth and resources of those big tech companies? You're talking about collaboration. Rafik Anadol's basically saying you have to. But this idea of the open AI, the open source, widely available, community shared resources, how realistic is it that they could take the next leap in the space race then?
Two things I would say to that. One, the academic breakthrough on the efficient use of data, which could change everything dramatically. Secondly, start from the bottom. Work with a small data set that you entirely create yourself. And this is what is very interesting about the program that's been run by Serpentine in London, because in their Future Art Ecosystems report published earlier this year, another reason why we're talking about this topic today, they have two planks that they've announced. One is that they want to experiment with creating something called a data trust. And that is something where the data is vested in a body and governed by a trustee, to answer the problem about where does this data come from and what is it being used for. And then secondly, in order to test that model, because this is a massive experiment, but starting at a small size, they are going around the United Kingdom collecting vocal data sets from community choirs, working with two of the leading AI artists in the world, Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst. And this is an extraordinary thing because, it's very imaginative to be working with a vocal data set for a start. The results, or the first stages of the results, will be presented at Serpentine in London, so people will be able to come and work with it. And they're going to be going around with a recording booth to capture this information. And one of the things they wanted to test was this question of ownership. Who owns the data set and what is it used for? So this experiment to collect vocal data sets and create a data trust is a wonderful way for people to reimagine, what an AI data set is and how they might engage with it. And I think this goes to the heart of the matter, because one of the reasons we as a publication have been looking at this question of AI and the democratization of information, who controls it, how might artists be involved, how might institutions be involved, is in order that our readers and I hope a wider public will engage with these questions rather than shut down and say, this is more complicated than I can manage.
Right.
And this is one of the things that art and the art world has, I think, a duty to do, to use the visuals of art and the academic allure of institutions to give people a way of thinking again of what is artificial intelligence, how does it work in my life? Because with one of the existential questions of our day, we have global warming, we have artificial intelligence, we have the fate of democracy. With those questions, one of the most important things is that people engage and think and talk to their friends and do not shut down. And I believe it's a duty of a publication to help people, to follow that path.
Absolutely. And one of the ways I think it will be most felt within the art world is in museums, because it's not necessarily the innovators in terms of creating new artworks that are going to have to contend with this. It's museums, because the fact is their authority in terms of the way artworks are presented, interpreted and circulated is going to be challenged, frankly, by AI. And we can see it on a daily basis how fast that process is moving, right? And so we've spoken to people in the museum community who are right at that coalface and having to make decisions now about, hang on a second, we want to be the place people go to find out about Leonardo or Manet or Faith Ringgold or whatever. And the fact is that the big tech companies are going to challenge us on that. They are going to want to be the first places that people go to find out this stuff. So tell us what they're saying. And is there a kind of existential concern there?
Thomas Campbell, formerly of the Met in New York, now in San Francisco, one of the leading museum curators in the world, was very interesting on this subject. Earlier this year, he was talking in Hong Kong. And he said it was important for museums to engage with big tech, where the power lies with AI, where the resource, the computing resource. Because, as he said, the power of AI in this case is to get past the challenges of classification, of analysis, to get people into the real richness of some of the amazing data archives that these museums hold. So that is the plus side. The challenge side is AI works using an analytical bot to give you the answer that you prompted it to give you. Now, the problem for museums is how do you manage that so that the cultural voice of the museum is preserved when you're using the wonderful power of this tech to give people a better way in to the information you have to provide? A parallel case is the news industry and Google search at the moment, where Google have announced a long heralded approach, so far only rolled out in the United States, where searches on Google will be summarized by an AI on the browser you're using, rather than taking you direct to the links that you're used to seeing. And this is a question of distancing. So is there a danger that when museums engage with AI, they'll get distance from their own scholarship, and so will their visitors, their consumers, as it were? This is something that has to be very carefully managed. It doesn't mean that it's an impossible task, but it's the big challenge.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting terms that's used in the piece actually is displacement. And I think that's a good term because it isolates that idea that this data exists and it will be provided to people, and that voice, that kind of authority, that framework that museums can provide might not be there anymore. One of the things I have encountered in my reading around AI, and particularly in the very good writings of James Bridle, for instance, is this idea that actually, despite it being called artificial intelligence, there's a lot of stupidity within these models, and actually they will often recommend wrong things and they will present things inaccurately. And that's a big question for museums, isn't it? Because not only is this data going to be repurposed and so on, but it might well be presented out of context or even erroneously.
That's exactly the challenge of the power of these bots to synthesize. All they can give you the most probable answer based on the data set and the way that the neural network has been set up to work with them. So the challenge for museum is how can you use the power of AI and still give people direct access, as it were, to that letter from Manet to Monet in the archive, rather than having things summarized, sometimes, with some misunderstanding of context or some synthetic answer, as it were. That's the big challenge. It's not an impossible one,
right?
But it's a very serious one.
But we've been talking on this podcast so much about resources-stricken museums. Museums are challenged on every level, resources-wise. How on earth are they going to be able to engage with AI in a meaningful way without lots of money? Is it almost like we're going to have to see them fundraising purely on a kind of technological basis in order that they can acquire funds from a tech bro who wants to be philanthropic and help museums engage with AI?
Well, one interesting thing is the quality of data available to these AI companies at the moment. Some of it from institutions, but a lot of it's scraped from the internet. What arts institutions and other academic bodies have is superior data, not necessarily available to the mass market models up until now. So the question is there some honest broker way of giving value to an institution that shares its higher quality data? In other words, that might be imagery, that might be text. And one of the interesting things about Refik Anadol's large language model is that he went straight to the main institutions in the field, the natural history institutions, Smithsonian, Cornell, Natural History Museum in London. And that, in a way, is a model. So the question is, how can institutions make a reasonable commercial arrangement, if that is what they choose to do, in order to shore up their bottom line? It brings a lot of questions with it.
Because if they don't engage, the information's going to get out there anyway, and it might well be wrong, and then they're just completely disenfranchised from the whole process. So they have to engage in some way.
That's Thomas Campbell's point. You have to engage. And what is interesting about future art ecosystems at Serpentine is that they're addressing a lot of the structural questions that art institutions need to think about. When they're thinking, we have a great data set, how are we going to make best use of it? That is one of the reasons that they brought out the AI report this year.
So to conclude, we shouldn't be too worried, but we need to be alert and alive to what's going on in AI.
We need to be alert and engaged and realize that the jury isn't out.
Thank you very much, Louis.
Thank you very much.
You can read the AI story and a series of case studies on the website or the app. Coming up, the rise of comics and Degas Miss Lala. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. Sotheby's has entered a consultation period in London as it prepares to make dozens of redundancies there, the art newspaper has learned. According to 4 anonymous sources, around 50 people are due to leave the firm in London. Further layoffs are expected at Sotheby's New York and its European locations, but the art newspaper understands that Sotheby's UK workforce will be particularly affected. Sotheby's declined to comment on the specifics of the restructuring, including any numbers or motivations behind it. However, a spokesperson for the auction house denied rumours that it intends to sell its London headquarters, saying that there are no plans to sell the building or leave New Bond Street. The spokesperson insisted that London is and will continue to be Sotheby's largest and most important centre for sales, exhibition and talent in Europe, and its second biggest sales location globally. Drawings recently discovered in Pompeii suggest that children watch gladiators battling in the ancient city's amphitheatre. The charcoal drawings depicting stick figures attacking wild boar were found during excavations at l'Insula di Casti Amanti, a group of homes in Pompeii's archaeological park that opened to the public for the first time on the 28th of May. In an Instagram post, Pompeii officials pointed out that exposure to extreme forms of violence, even for small children aged between 5 and 7, is not only a problem in our own times with the advent of video games and social media. They added that the difference is that during antiquity, the blood spilt on the arena was real. The drawings are being studied by experts in child psychology from the University of Naples, Federico II. Gabriele Zuctrigal, the director of Pompeii's archaeological park, told the Guardian newspaper that the archaeological and psychological experts concluded that the drawings of the gladiators and hunters were made based on direct vision and not from pictorial models. Meanwhile, researchers studying a 4,000-year-old ancient Egyptian skull have identified what might be an early case of cancer surgery. Held in the University of Cambridge's Duckworth collection, the skull bears tiny cut marks visible under microscope, which indicate that the Egyptians operated on tumours or examined them after the person's death. The paleontologist Edgar Camaros of the University of Santiago de Compostela in Spain and co-author of the search paper published in the journal Frontiers said the results were very unexpected. We were very sceptical at the beginning when we saw the cut marks in the microscope, he said, although they were very clear. It took a bit to realise we were visualising the evidence of a milestone in the history of medicine. You can read these stories and much more on the website or the app. Now, the Centre Pompidou in Paris this week opened Comics on Every Floor, an extravaganza dedicated to comic art and graphic novels that takes in the entire Pompidou complex, from the exhibition galleries to the Museum of Modern Art, the library, and even IRCAM, the Centre for Musical Research. It arrives at a moment when comics are riding high, too, in the art market, with events including the exclusive Lake Como Comic Art Festival in Italy. Joel Meadows is a comics specialist and the editor-in-chief of the magazine Tripwire, and I spoke to him about the increasing prominence of what the Francophone world calls the ninth art. Joel, the Centre Pompidou is doing this enormous event where it's basically every floor of the museum dedicated to bande dessinée, as they call it, comics. And it seems to me that this is a really significant moment. They're saying that one of the ways in which this is a sort of landmark event is that they're really uniting European, Asian and US comic cultures together. I think for our listenership who may not be aware of comic cultures, can you explain a bit more about why that's significant? Are there subcultures, if you like, within a subculture of comics? And how significant are these three idioms, if you like?
Well, yeah, I guess they are different. I mean, they grew up at the same time. You know, European comics has definitely been influenced by American comics, but they have grown up differently. You know, for many years, Europe has seen comics as a legitimate art form, whereas in the US and also in the UK, it's not quite the same. I mean, things are changing. I mean, David Zwirner, who represents Robert Crumb, who's a very well-known US underground artist, they did a huge exhibition of his stuff probably about 10 years ago or so. But as you say, there is a little bit of a subdivide between kind of European, Japanese, and US versions of the form. So it is interesting that this is all together because they're all equally valid and they all bring something different to the table. And you know, things like Japanese comics, manga, have had a huge influence on the US market, and the European markets had a little bit of influence on the US as well. But having it all together in such a prestigious place, you know, like the Pompidou in Paris, it is pretty impressive to bring this all together.
Tell us more about what the community might think of this, because of course it is a massive worldwide community, comics, but how much does a museum event like this legitimization within a kind of fine art framework, if you like. How much does that mean to a comic community? Is it something that they will feel pride about, or is it a sort of shrug of the shoulders?
Well, they're not looking for it, but it does add extra legitimacy to the form. I mean, back in 2017, Scottish comic artist Frank Quitely, he had his exhibition at the Kelvin Grove in Glasgow, which, as you know, is a very highly regarded exhibition space. I know this is a guy that's drawn sort of Superman and Batman. I said that was back in 2017. So, I mean, it's just comic readers and the community, they don't look for things like this, but I think that they do feel that it is something that adds extra legitimacy to the form, and bring it all together, I think, is very interesting, because you talked about, Japanese comics, something like Akira by Katsushiro Otomo, which they made into an anime, I guess it was about 30 years ago now, as a film which has had a huge influence on things like cinema, but also on American comics. So bringing it all together, I think, is something which is great, and having it all in one place and having all the different things, because they all kind of feed in, and the language of comics is an international one. Whether you're publishing in French and Italian and in Japanese or English or American English, I think the language is the same. Because people enjoy comics, they'll enjoy comics whatever language it's in. And so I think the aficionados of the form do find it gratifying that an event like this is taking place.
And I guess one of the things that's interesting about it is you've got this enormous explosion, for instance, in the world of Marvel, in terms of the spectacle of cinema and series and so on.
Yes.
But of course, there is a really wide-ranging intellectual underpinning of comics, right? So of all different types. And it seems to me that that's another thing that this Centre Pompidou show will do. It will present it within the context of art and of literature and of broader cultural forms in a way that has always been there, but perhaps is less widely understood by those who might not be part of the comic community.
I guess in terms of American comics, the big sea change, the paradigm shift, was people like Daniel Clowes and Peter Bagge, who were the US indie comic creators. And Clowes is a man who's won a number of awards. I think he was nominated for the Grand Prix at Angoulême back in January, which was won by Posey Simmons. But, his stuff is published by Fantagraphics, but it is published by a UK publisher. It's published by Vintage, which obviously is part of Jonathan Cape. So it's a major publisher. But, that big sea change happened in the 90s. And also, Posey Simmons, who won, she's had a huge career working, for The Guardian, and she's a very highly regarded artist. And I think she went to the Sorbonne. I think she's trained in Paris. So I think there has been a big change. And I guess this Pompidou exhibition, is sort of like a coming together, an acknowledgement, that things have changed, and that comic art is seen as a legitimate form, just as legitimate as fine art or collage or photography, and to be uttered in the same breath as these other forms of art.
Now, you went to Lake Como recently, where there was this comic art festival.
Yes.
I think when we say comic art festival, we imagine vast crowds, cosplay, massive amounts of merchandise and so on. But this is not that kind of event. Tell us more about the Lake Como event.
Well, Lake Como, I think this is the 5th or the 6th year that's been running, and it's purely dedicated to the collecting of original comic art. So I think the ticket numbers are capped at 500 or 600 people. Tickets are very expensive. It's a very exclusive show. I think it's €300 for the weekend and €500 if you want this VIP ticket. They have a launch at this very elegant 18th century place called the Villa Urba, which is next to the venue on the Friday night. So they have sort of like drinks and sit-down foods, and the artists, the guests from the show are there. So it's a very different show. There's no merchandising. There's no people dressed in costume. The only people selling things are art dealers who are there with the artists who are selling their wares. So as well as having stuff commissioned, they will also sell their original art pages. So it's a very different beast. It's not busy. It's got a very relaxed feel to it. So it's about the art of comics.
And we're talking about vast sums of money changing hands,
yes,
right? Tell us about that.
Well, some pages start at around about €1,600. The people who are there, they do commissions for anything from 1,000 to 2,000 euros up to 5,000 and above. And that this year they had just over 70 artists, and so it's over 2 days. So you can kind of do the maths, and the huge quantities of money change hands. And these people are serious collectors. They'll come from all the way around Europe, from Australia, from the US. They'll come to Lake Como because it's a destination show where the artists who they admire, it might be the only chance they have to see them in this space. And also because you don't get the huge queues, they can talk to their artists, they can commission the work, they can connect with them on a much more intimate level than they would at a big sort of regular comic event.
And tell us, who are the people that are collecting comic art? Is it people that are also collecting fine art, or is it a completely different niche category where basically you've got people collecting only comics and only comic designs and so on?
Well, I think there is a crossover. I mean, I think it is partly I guess a lot of them are sort of the baby boomers and people with, fairly deep pockets, professional people, who are your lawyers and people in the kind of professional sphere who enjoy this stuff because it's suddenly take a huge jump in terms of its value. It's a really good investment, especially over the last sort of 10 or 20 years. I've made a little bit of a list. As recently as, I think it was a couple of years ago, The Dark Knight Returns, the Frank Miller comic, the original art for the first issue of that went for, I think it was something crazy like $2.2 million at auction. And then this year, Neil Gaiman, who created Sandman, he sold his original collection to raise money for this thing called the Hero Initiative, which is a charitable foundation giving money back to people who worked in the industry. And he sold a Watchmen page signed to him by Dave Gibbons. He was given in the late 80s for $132,000. So the market is huge, and the market keeps growing. The market was created partly by heritage auctions, and they started life selling old comics, and the price of old comics has gone up, and so they are tangentially connected because they went up, and then original comic art in a connected fashion, the price of that has gone through the roof as well. And the thing about original comic art is that there's only one. With comics, they printed between 200,000 and 1 million copies of some of the older comics, but within a piece of original art, and I know that the original art dealers use this as a selling point, which is fair enough, that you're the only person that can get this page or this cover. So that's why some of these things are so in demand.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because, of course, if it is an original example of comic art,
yes,
then potentially per comic, you've got very, very many individual frames of original art. So potentially a comic artist could become very rich on the back of it.
Yes. Oh, definitely. I know that Jim Lee, he's at the top of DC, he bought an issue of Fantastic Four, and there's about 24 pages, and some of those pages can go for as much as like $50,000 each. So these comics, as you say, a whole issue can be worth in the millions. And so artists now become a lot more canny at monetizing, because in the old days they would create the work, they would get paid by the publisher, and then that would be the end. There were many years when the publisher wouldn't even return the art. There was a bit of a controversy because a lot of publishers wouldn't give the artists their work back.
Right.
And some people, it would go missing or they wouldn't return it. But now original art is such a huge field that it's a major part of an artist's revenue now.
Tell us some more about who are the kind of leading figures within the field now. So if you are beginning a journey into collecting original comic art, who are the artists that everyone is after?
Well, I guess it's classic artists. You talked about Marvel, people like Jack Kirby, who was, the co-creator of all of the big Marvel characters. Your Fantastic Four and your X-Men and your Avengers. So somebody like him, Neil Adams, who was a DC artist, who brought a very kind of commercial art approach to drawing comics. His big runs were sort of Batman in the 1970s. So people like that, slightly younger but well-established artists like Mike Mignola, who created Hellboy, which they've made 3 films based on, and the aforementioned Jim Lee, he's quite high up at DC, but he's also spent a long time drawing sort of things like X-Men and Batman for DC and Marvel. So people like that. But the thing about original art, although it has gone through the roof, is that in a way, you try and kind of tailor it, to the art that you appreciate yourself. You find an artist that you like, and you try and follow them, and you even try and look at like the next artist who you might think might be, in demand. Like last year, there was an artist called Riccardo Federici, who's an Italian artist, and his real art was originally going for €1,600, and he wasn't an established artist, but he's a very talented artist. So there is the next generation that people can look at, and you can probably get a sense and go, okay, this guy or this female artist, it can be obviously, a male or a female artist. The thing is, it's quite broad now, and you can go, okay, these people, you can see they're going to be big, and you can follow their art, and you won't have to spend quite as much as you would on, the really established artists, and you can build it up, and you can kind of curate your own collection. And as I said, you can tailor it to the things that you like yourself as a collector.
So obviously now we're in the realms of a lot of digital animation.
Yes.
A lot of the films that are being produced are using digital animation.
Yes.
Has that impacted the amount of art that's being produced in traditional media, if you like? So, you've been to this comic convention. Clearly, there's a lot of people buying analog art. Is it being affected by the rise of digital?
I think people like physical objects. There's an artist called Brian Bolland, who's a British comic artist, who switched to digital about 20 or so years ago, which means that the value of his art, before that date has gone through the roof, because he's not creating art physically anymore. But a lot of artists do still work physically, because a lot of people like the physicality of using their pen or their pencil actually on the paper. I mean, some people mix, some people start physically and then move to digital for sort of cleaning up their art. So I think it's not quite as clear cut as that. And as I said, people still like to have, because it's about the novelty. You know, if you're creating art digitally, then to be quite honest, anybody could create that piece of art if they had a decent printer. They could just get the file, whereas with a physical piece, it is a one-off item. So I think people do like having to say, I'm the guy that's got, you know, the Dark Knight Returns. It's almost like bragging rights to say that I've got this, you know, this amazing page. Like there was this page of art, which I didn't think was that impressive, but I think it went for just over $4 million, this Spider-Man Secret Wars page done by this guy called Mike Zeck. I think that was 2 years ago. And that was unbelievable because it was a page from a reasonably unremarkable comic from the 1980s, but because it was this Spider-Man clone thing, the cost of the page was insane. And then you've got people like Frank Frazetta, I haven't even talked about, who was a comic artist and a painter, and his Conan piece, his Conan the Barbarian painting, went for over $1 million, and it was the first piece of comic art which passed the $1 million mark. And so each time since then it's been climbing. His art's gone. There was one piece he did which was a cover for a 1970s for a heavy metal album which went for $6 million. So these figures are staggering. You would never have imagined 10 or 15 years ago that these pieces would be so in demand, and that, you know, that the value of them would be so insane.
That's really interesting. And I think one of the things that you point to there is that, very much like other forms of art, it's not necessarily about execution or imagery or one single quality that defines what collectors are after. There's a whole realm of cultural references that they're exploring, and it can be anything that can tip it over those huge figures.
I mean, I remember when I was a kid, there was a shop called Comic Showcase of Covent Garden, and they'd have pages that are now worth 50,000 that they sell for like £100. Because nobody knew the value of these things. Comics was a reasonably young art form, and basically everything felt so kind of throwaway. You know, people would create this art. Nobody knew that they were working on things that would still be considered, and not just considered, but, you know, taken seriously 30 or 40 years later.
Are you kicking yourself that you didn't buy things?
Well, I was a kid, unfortunately. So that's one of the frustrating things, But
it seems like it's on an upwards trajectory anyway.
It doesn't. There's no sign of the bubble bursting at the moment. It seems like, you know, values are still climbing. It's amazing. And, you know, I mean, off the back of Como, there's an Orlando show that they do, which is a very similar sort of principle. So it's an original art show in Orlando, in Florida, but a lot of American collectors, because it's easier for them to get to, they're starting to go there, you know, rather than go to Italy. I mean, I'd rather go to Como, if I was honest, but I can see for convenience's sake. But, you know, there are people that spend serious money. These people spend, you know, the kind of money that you would expect a fine art collector to spend on these things.
Joel, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
Comics on Every Floor is at the Centre Pompidou in Paris until the 4th of November. You can read Joel's article about the Lake Como Festival in our June edition. And finally, it's time for the work of the week. Next week, the National Gallery in London opens to discover Degas and Miss Lala, in which one of the best-known works in its collection, Edgar Degas' painting of a black circus performer known as Miss Lala, is analysed in new detail. The cornerstone of the new information is research into the acrobat, Albertine Olga Brown, known as Olga, the power relationship between the sitter and the artist, and Degas' own complex heritage. Anne Robbins, the curator of paintings at the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, is the organiser of the exhibition, and she has worked with, among others, Sterre Overmars, the curatorial fellow for post-1800 paintings at the National. I spoke to them about the painting and what the new research tells us. Anne, the painting Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando has been in the National Gallery's collection for a century or so.
Almost a century.
Yes.
It was acquired through the Curator Fund early in 1925. So yes, so the gallery is celebrating 100 years of its acquisition.
Right, but the extraordinary thing is, in a way, you now know more about it, and research into this painting has expanded in the last decade or so, and that's because of a new focus on sitters as well as artists.
Yes, indeed. Yes, there has been a lot of new research on the painting in the past 20 years or so. So technical research, research on the subject of representations of the circus, and indeed research on the subject of black models in Paris in the 1870s and 1880s. So our exhibition is drawing on this new material and showcasing it for the first time here at the National Gallery.
Right. And Sterre, the particular model for Degas' painting in this instance is somebody called, we now know, Albertine Olga Brown. She's been known as Olga Brown for some time, but we now know her full name, and that's new, right?
Yes, it is. Louis Fernstein, a external researcher, has been researching Miss Lala for quite some time now, and we're very happy to team up with her. And she has given us a lot of information about Olga, Miss Lala, Anne Albertine Brown. And now we know more about her than ever, yes.
Thanks to Laurie Fierstein, so that New York biographer, we managed to get in touch with Miss Lala's descendant, and this has helped us identify and locate photographic portraits of her that were previously unknown and that we are presenting in the exhibition for the first time. So there will be a lot of new material that really help us get a better sense of who she was and her place, not only in the circus world but also in society.
Can you tell us more then about her act? Because this is what Degas depicts in this painting. It's an extraordinary act, and I think we now see it in a way that is probably different from how it was seen in the 19th century. But tell us exactly what she did in the circus.
Yes, so she was an incredibly talented athlete and performer. And in fact, she had two signature acts that made her famous. In one of these, she was suspended from the ceiling of the circus, hanging from a trapeze, and she was holding a cannon, allegedly weighing 300 kilos, between her teeth. You know, there was a cable attached to it, and she was supporting its weight by the only strength of her jaw. So it was what is still called an iron jaw act, which is a specific field of circus performances. But the act that Degas chose to depict is a different one, also one she was incredibly famous for, where she was being raised to the rafters of the circus ceiling, suspended to a rope, to a cable, which went through a pulley and then was attached to a kind of mouthpiece, you know, a bit that she clenched between her teeth. So again, she was supporting her whole weight in that way, and then she was being hauled and lifted to the circus ceiling without losing the grip. And even though it was so incredibly dangerous, that was before safety nets were introduced, at least they were starting to be introduced, but in that act she didn't have any. So it's also a moment of great danger and part of the fascination for her performance, for the show in itself, and for the painting, very much relied on this.
Sterre, can you tell us something about Degas' reputation at this time? So it's 5 years after the first Impressionist exhibition. Is he a famous artist as such at this stage?
Yeah, he definitely is a famous artist. He made a lot of paintings of ballet dancers that were very well known. He was also a bit of a rebel. Am I allowed to say, Anne?
Yes, he had been seeking official recognition, you know, by exhibiting at the Salon in the second part of the 1860s, and then banded with that group of independent artists who were trying to make their mark on the Paris art scene by organizing independent shows, and you know the stories, these Impressionist exhibitions in which Degas was a founding member of the first one and was very much involved in the planning of the exhibitions, because he wanted his work to be seen and sold, and he wanted to develop a clientele for his pictures. But at that particular point in 1879, he needs to earn money. You know, his father died in 1874. His father had been a banker. This changes things financially for him, even though he's more financially secure than some of his Impressionist peers. And he goes to the fourth Impressionist exhibition with the idea of exhibiting their painting, which will further establish his reputation. You know, in him depicting Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando is also part of this intention of picturing a very famous model, because she was incredibly famous.
She's way more famous than he is.
Well, yes, I mean, it's attracting probably a different kind of audience as well. Circus was a popular form of entertainment, but yes, she would have been represented on posters all over Paris at the time. And we are in the exhibition. We're including these posters borrowed from the Bibliothèque Nationale, from different collections in Paris to really attest to her celebrity at the time. But, Degas may also be capitalizing on Miss Lala's fame at that point, because he named the painting Miss Lala at the Cirque Fernando with a slight spelling mistake. But still,
Miss Lola.
Miss Lola. But her name kept being misspelled anyway into words, Laza, Zozo. Yes, constantly distorted. And she only kept that name for a very short time anyway, for about 4 years, between 1877 and 1881. These artists, these circus artists, constantly reinvented themselves with different new identities as they developed new feats.
Right, and Olga was from Central Europe, right? So she's of mixed heritage, but she actually came from what's now Poland.
Yes, yeah, she was from what was then called Stettin in Prussia. So her father was African American and her mother was Prussian, German. Yeah, so she was from Central Europe, but she traveled all over Europe. She traveled to Spain, of which we have one of the posters. She traveled to France, obviously, because of the painting. She was in England even. We have a Canterbury poster. So we have all sorts of evidence of her traveling all over Europe. And that is also why we know that she was only known as Miss Lala for a short few years, because afterwards she started using the name Olga. So that's where that part of her identity came from, is because we know it from the few posters that we have where she does call herself Olga, but luckily now we know the rest of her name.
As you say, Degas needs to make an impact with this painting, and he needs money for a start. So he thinks of it as a showstopper. He knows that this is the painting he wants to show in this exhibition, in the Impressionist exhibition. But weirdly, he doesn't deliver it on time. It arrives sort of a couple of weeks after the show opens.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
No, this is slightly puzzling because it's it's a work on which he spent a long time elaborating, and there are almost 20 preparatory drawings and pastels and painted study for it. So an unusually large body of work relating to that work. In fact, I think it might be the largest body of work focusing on a single painting in Degas's oeuvre. The second I can think of is the Portrait de Famille, the Bellili family in the Musée d'Orsay, for which there is a very large number of preparatory studies. But it is pretty unique in that sense. But having said this, the painting is not at the opening of the fourth Impressionist show in 1879. So maybe Degas may have still been working on it, but we tend to think this is unlikely because we know from his correspondence that he had moved on to different projects. He was working on different things with specific sitters, projects for portrait. So maybe he tried to give greater impact to its arrival by sending it a few weeks later, but we don't know. In any case, it didn't work very well for him because as a result it attracted less attention. The reviewers must have gone to the Fourth Impressionist show in the first days or weeks of its opening, and by the time it joined, I suppose its effect was declining. And we've identified only 3 reviews mentioning it, and one was even published the following year by Huysmans. So relatively little impact at the time.
Now, one of the things that is so amazing about the catalogue for this exhibition, it seems to me, is that you're really at last exploring Degas's own history, in the sense that one of the things that is relatively little known about Degas is that he himself is of mixed heritage. He is Creole on his mother's side, right? Sterre, do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so his mother was from Louisiana. She was from New Orleans. And she was from, she was from a Creole background. So when Degas went to New Orleans in 1872, 1873, this was his first, the time he met people from Creole background, people from different mixed race backgrounds, black people in that sense. And we think that this has made a profound impact on the way that he handled his artworks in the years after.
That's something we want to question with this exhibition, is what does it mean for Degas in 1879 to be painting a model? I mean, she's not an artist model, but let's say a sitter who is not white. What did it mean for him, given the fact that his mother was Creole, that he had a chance to observe firsthand during that stay in New Orleans in 72, 73, the diversity of life in New Orleans at the time. So we were questioning this in the exhibition. Degas's mother indeed was born in New Orleans, so she was Creole but of European descent, i.e. she was white. But there were non-white people in Degas' lineage. In fact, Degas's mother's direct cousin was a freeman of color. So he had some exposure to that world, which was unusual for a French artist, for a very Parisian artist like Degas. First, that he had this, in general, he has a complicated and slightly unusual heritage. One of his grandfathers born in Saint-Domingue, so present-day Haiti, and his other grandfather lives in Naples, where he founded a bank. So, not a straightforward background for a very French Parisian artist. And he, as Sterre said, when he is in 1872-73 in New Orleans, and he only stays there for a short time, for about 5 months. He's very impressed by what he described as the very bright light outside, and he describes, of course, this has to be put back in the context of the time. These are words which have very racist connotations today, but he describes the white babies in black arms, and that's something again he witnesses even inside his family's house in New Orleans, because we know that his uncle and aunt were employing black labor to look after Degas's nephews and nieces. So he had that access to a world which was very far from what he could observe in the streets of Paris.
Right, absolutely. And I suppose one of the key things about this particular painting in relation to all this background is how we see Degas interpreting a black figure. On the one hand, he names the black figure. In that sense, he's giving her agency. But on the other hand, as Darcy Grimaldo Grigsby says in a really fantastic essay, I think, in the catalogue, we are looking at a depiction of a black woman who is being hoisted into the air on a rope in Degas' studio, and she's clinging on to life with her mouth. And this, as an image, is incredibly disturbing. I don't know how disturbing it was to audiences at the time, but it seems to me that today you cannot look at this without a certain level of flinching, don't you think, Sterre?
Yeah, definitely, I think so. And to audiences back in the day, this was, in a sense, this was her agency, because she was the one who invented the iron jaw. She was the first one to ever do such a feat and to have her hoisted up in the air. So I think to audiences back in the 19th century, this was a very recognizable image, because people knew that this was what she did. People knew that this was what she came up with, what she performed in many stages around the world. But I think with the knowledge that we have now, it gives a different impression to the painting. And I think that's what Darcy is trying to bring awareness to.
Yes, no, of course, the paintings, there are all these other connotations, and which are sometimes incredibly disturbing, and you have to acknowledge the violence of what she's doing, of that position, being suspended from a pulley from 20 meters high from the circus ceiling is violent and dangerous. So we are acknowledging this in the exhibition. We go into it in more depth in the catalogue, and we hope it will trigger a new approach to the painting, a new way of looking at it.
The painting has always been powerful. It's always been an extraordinary image because of the de sotto in su direction from beneath that Degas gives the composition. But it has an extra charge when you consider the people involved, I guess.
Degas, went to great lengths to actually recreate her pose in the studio. Not only did he observe her attending the performances themselves at the circus, but he recreated her pose. So calling Miss Lala, Olga, to come to the studio during several sessions, and installing a pulley to the ceiling of his studio for her to be able to reenact her feat inside the studio. So that clearly mattered to him, and also imposed great hardship on her.
Right,
so not only was it a performance that she performed it, we know, every evening at 8:30 at Cirque Fernando. At least during a month and a half, starting early December 1878 and ending, I think, on the 9th or 10th of January of the following year. But she was also called on we think, at least 4 occasions to Degas' studio to recreate this pose for 2.5 hours, apparently, in the morning. So something which also required incredible physical endurance. And one can only speculate as to how she felt about this, being a mixed heritage model being suspended from a pulley from the ceiling of an artist studio.
It questions all those sort of aspects that we've talked about a lot in recent years in terms of an artist's power in relation to their model, which of course gain an extra dimension because the model in this case is black.
Exactly. Our exhibition, yes, is following from this. There's this new approach that increasingly places the focus not only on the artist himself, but try and shift the gaze of the viewer towards its sitter and its model, and find out more about them, and therefore casting new light on the artwork itself.
Okay, well, Anne and Sterre, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Discover Degas and Miss Lala is at the National Gallery in London from the 6th of June until the 1st of September. The catalogue is published by the National Gallery and priced $16.95. And that's it for this episode. You can find us on X, formerly known as Twitter, @TownAudio, and on Facebook, Instagram and Threads. The Week in Art is produced by Julie Michalska, Alexander Morrison and David Clack. David is also the sound designer, and the editor of this episode is me. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests, Louis, Joel, Anna and Sterre. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.